on the screen recorder. Yeah, but visit this URL, take this survey. Really good. I think it's going to give us a much better idea of who's in the community and try to increase participation from underrepresented groups. Definitely something we're really excited about. Yeah. Hi, my name is Alec. You might know me. I have been around in the community for about 4 or 5 years. I work with a lot of higher education institutions. Right now I run a group called Tandem. We do some different things. We don't usually do like really hands-on site implementations, but that's more my past, is working in a digital agency context where we're doing implementations of sites for departments and institutes and other people in the higher education space. Most of my experience has been architecting solutions, working with clients. I'm kind of one of those people that interfaces in between technical stakeholders and business stakeholders. So, I'm the guy that does everything from systems architecture to also running like storyboarding workshops, persona workshops, other more strategy-oriented facets of an engagement. I wear an executive swancho. For those who aren't familiar with what a swancho is, that's a sweater poncho. So, and that's part of that's just a byproduct of living in the Bay Area and having an unfortunate California accent. So if I say like and a lot, that's just my upbringing. I'm sorry, my people raised me that way. Yeah, definitely find me on Twitter, @ReynoldsAlec. Think Tandem's probably the best place to follow me. We also make a cool product called Calabox. If you do any sort of local development for Drupal, we're the main open source sponsors of that tool. So definitely check out Calabox as well. But I'm not really here to talk about that stuff. What I am here to talk about is the relationships we have as vendors with higher ed stakeholders. And the primary stakeholder I'm interested in here is what I think of as web services professionals. I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean about that later. Talking kind of about some of the misunderstandings that have occurred in my relationships with folks that I consider to be higher ed stakeholders in the past, and a lot of the opportunities that I see that we have for working better with one another, and just the opportunities we have for fun projects, and some of my experiences with those fun projects. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about a lot of the tools we use to collaborate together, and the main two tools that I'm interested in this talk are hosting platforms and distributions. So these are some of the most powerful tools that we have to collaborate, and some of those powerful tools that I think that web services professionals have for providing a framework for vendors like myself, so we don't go total cowboy and go off the reservation and do something really crazy that you can't maintain, that doesn't follow your guidelines, etc. Just for me to get kind of an idea of who's in the audience, how many people would consider themselves to be higher education stakeholders of some sort? Okay, cool. You're all on this side of the room too. That's good. That's we got kind of like it. How many people would consider themselves to be vendors of some sort, working with? Okay, cool. So we got kind of okay, and Sean's in the middle. Okay. Yeah.
Internal vendor.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, that's a very good distinction too, and that's a good nuance. Some of the things we won't be talking about: who to blame for project failure. I'm not somebody that really likes pointing fingers. Who's the best hosting provider, or the best CI tool provider, or the best vendor of services for any given problem. Again, I'm very tool and methodology agnostic. I believe that the tools we choose at our institutions or at our agencies, those are tools that have a story. I'm more interested in the story of how we selected those tools and then how we write the next chapter on how we evolve those tools to be better suited for all the actors that are in our stories. Unfortunately, I had a lot of topics I really wanted to cover in this presentation that I don't think we're gonna have time for. I put them on my session description. So if you're here for QA procedure, branding guidelines, accessibility requirements, all this other stuff, I would love to talk about it more, and maybe we'll have a couple minutes at the end of the presentation or over lunch to discuss that stuff. But even though it is super, super important, probably equally as important as the topics we will be talking about, we don't have time probably. Yeah, but again, if you're interested in following stuff, Think Tandem or Calabox, actually Calabox and me, we talk about a lot of this stuff. I'm not going to lie. I think a lot of the things that I might bring up, particularly in the first part of this presentation, where I talk about some of the potential misunderstandings that we can have as vendors with higher education institutions, is a little bit contentious. So definitely raise your hand if you think I'm misrepresenting something. You know, I'm an expert about many things, but I am not always as eloquent as I could be, and I definitely really respect my counterparts in higher education and my peers as vendors. But first, a couple terms. You know, I'm already throwing around kind of higher ed as a broader term. I'm throwing around vendor as a broader term. Web services, you'll hear me say a lot. Actually, I'm really curious, out of all these terms, what do you think about the application? How many people would actually identify with the term web services if you work? Okay, and that's only maybe half of the people I heard. Oh yeah, is everyone else, do you actually work for a department or institution? Okay. Does anyone really take offense with the idea of being called a web services professional in higher education?
That's perfect.
Okay, awesome. This is definitely how I think about it, and so that's my basic kind of overview of some of the things I'll be throwing around. And as I said, you know, we're focusing on this relationship. I think the thing that made me really want to talk about this topic was a somewhat embarrassing email I received a couple years ago. It was an email from a web services professional. They were no one I had ever worked with. They were at a university that we did a project for, and one of my team members wrote a case study. And you know, a typical kind of manager at an agency, whenever one of your team members writes a blog article or any sort of content, you're just get it on the blog. Somebody did something, we need to have more material, let's not worry about this, let's just get it on the blog. So there was very little QA of this article. And I think he may have misrepresented a couple things after I reread it. Obviously he misrepresented a couple things because I got a pretty lengthy email that took some issues with the post. And the things that really interested me about it honestly didn't offend me at all. I honestly felt very bad when I read this, and I went back, read the case study, and I'm wow, this makes us seem like miracle workers. And you know, one of the quotes that I think was really demonstrative from this guy's email that made me reconsider the case study. This last quote actually on here. Frankly, if you're trying to portray yourselves as experts, then trying things on a whim doesn't really sound very expert. You know, you can't just come in here to somebody else's project and try a couple, you know, rewrite a bunch of things and then say you've made the cure for cancer and made all of our problems go away as a university. That's just patently untrue. That's impossible. I also, one of the things that he pointed out that I thought was that kind of hit made me really reconsider this as well, was talking about how a lot of the things we had mentioned in the case study actually came from previous vendors. This wasn't like it was a fundamental case at the university, trying to, create some sort of weird system. This was things that, a series of older vendors had introduced. So this kind of made me think about the reasons why we work with universities in the first place. And I honestly think these are very persuasive reasons why if you don't do work with higher education institutions, you should. Working with universities, in my mind, is really great. You guys are values driven, you're always thinking about new ideas, you're in an academic environment that promotes different ways of thinking. A lot of times when I go to a small or medium-sized business and I try to introduce agile methodologies or new strategies and ways of thinking about things, I run up against some CEO or some marketing director who's just kind of nope, we want the website, we want it now, we don't care about this touchy-feely user interview type thing. Let's just get coding. That's what we hired you for. When I go into a university department, I feel like there's a lot of people that are very receptive to these new ways of thinking, and that is just such a relief to us as vendors. There's some problems, though, I think that people come against whenever I say that I work a lot with higher education clients, I get a lot of knee-jerk reactions, and it's all from people that don't work in higher education. But nonetheless, I think these are preconceptions that can really damage relationships between vendors and higher education institutions. There's this kind of preconception that things are slow working with universities. The development cycle is slow. The sales cycle is slow. There's lots of sales requirements and contract requirements that you don't have to deal with. People almost think of working in higher education as working with government. And I can tell you, having gone to like government RFP conferences and bid on government projects, that is patently untrue. Like, it is so much easier to work with higher education clients. So thank you for everyone that makes that possible, because you guys really do help with that. Yeah, there's also this preconception that, and this is kind of similar to the government case, right? The universities are working with older technology. And yeah, that's sometimes true, but it's no more true than working in the private sector. I've seen equally screwed up things on either side of the fence. And I think one of the things that is fairly true, again, is not unique to higher education, but can be an issue, is limited budgets. Sometimes universities, and particularly their technology departments, I mean, they just don't get the money they need. And I'm sure some of you are on the short end of that stick occasionally. Hopefully you have some good fundraising, some good grant cycles occasionally too, and good budget years. Yeah, and that's really the underlying thing. It's like, as vendors, we shouldn't be seen as the people that just swoop in and fix everything, because we can't do that. We can't fix all the fundamental issues, all the fundamental problems, or make like a fundamentally better way of doing website development at a university. A lot of that facilitation is really up to web services departments and in the connection between us as vendors. So this is kind of my, for any time I've ever complained about working with any sort of higher education client, and we all have our complaints, this is kind of my I have sinned moment, but I realize my weaknesses and I'm willing to put that out on the line and try to build a better world. We can't swoop in everything. This was literally my response to the gentleman that had an issue with our case study. It's like, of course we swooped in and fixed everything. We're Batman. Like, that's our job, right? But it's not. We can't fix everything. And likewise, we can't expect absolutely perfect tool sets from our counterparts in web services. We can just expect to try to build a better relationship and better tool sets over time and try to work better with one another. So how do we actually get into some of these situations where we have people like making overly boastful case studies? How do we get into bad situations like budget overruns that require like change requests that just feel like pulling teeth? Just disappointing projects in general, under delivery, expectations blown through. How do we get there? I think it all comes back to, we always have resource limitations, but we can handle those resource limitations if we actually have a plan. And it's that the plan in this case is really these tools that we use to collaborate with one another. So I think the most important tools, outlined this in the beginning, we're only really gonna have time for these first top two, as I mentioned. Hosting, I view as kind of our canvas. This is where we work, this is where we actually, our work is displayed to the world. But it's also a really powerful place where all our workflows happen. This is where, if you're onboarding a new vendor into your university, this is one of the first things they're really going to interact with, and one of the most important things to have a streamlined process around. So our choices in what hosting vendors we're working with, both as vendors and as higher education institutions, matters a lot. I've seen a couple of broad trends in higher education that I think are pretty important. And I'm kind of curious actually what categories people feel like they fall into. How many people feel like they rely on some sort of platform as a service provider? Okay, so a few folks. How many folks have like an on-campus solution? And it could even be a cloud vendor, honestly, that you're just maintaining that's not a okay, so we got kind of, and then how many folks, this is a category that perhaps I made up, but I feel like there's a couple representatives of it. When I talk about campus runs past, we'll talk about this later, but it's more or less a push-button solution that a campus is running that allows departments to onboard their own developers. And I'm going to use an example of a Dockerized infrastructure that's at Stanford, but there's different ways you can do this. And does anyone kind of, some maybe a tentative hand, like, okay. So we'll talk more about that. This is kind of a category I think that there's more discussion around. Does anyone have like a different category of hosting provider that you feel like you utilize on your campus or you've worked with as a vendor?
We have a campus run SAS too.
I think that's actually a good, and that's one of the difficulties. When we talk about distributions, like I feel like that's kind of like this weird intersection of distribution and hosting. It's kind of campus run SaaS provider. But I think that's that's definitely one of the things that's missing here. So yeah, so PaaS providers, we have a lot of really good options in the Drupal space. We work with a lot of universities. I think they're on Pantheon, but we've seen very successful implementations on Aquia Cloud. I'm curious, is anyone using platform.sh in the higher education context at this point? I haven't really seen that, so I'd be interested to hear folks' experiences if you know anyone. But in general, I feel like the advantages here that we've seen as vendors, just probably one of the best workflows for us in terms of onboarding and just working continually in environments. All these PaaS providers, you have your dev element, your test, and your live environments. You can spin up environments easily for individual developers, for individual features that you're working on as a developer, merge that in easily, deploy that work very easily. All this stuff is push button functionality that can be done even by a site builder or someone that's not really comfortable with version control or something. One of the advantages I feel like we like as vendors, and I'm sure web services professionals, you guys I'm sure enjoy as well, you don't have these middle of the night fire drills, the kind of beeper going off, hey, the main admissions site is down, like everything is on fire and the apocalypse is nigh. That's not going to happen. You're not going to be losing sleep.
They don't pay us enough for that.
They don't. They will never pay you enough for that. Like no one will ever pay me enough for me to. I'm an 8 hours of sleep kind of guy. So, automated scaling. I put that up here. I mean that can be an overblown claim on the part of a lot of these vendors, these PaaS vendors. Sometimes their scaling isn't as good as they might say, but it's fairly good and it's a lot better than what I could do if I was, just like trying to run something on a low-cost basis. The other advantage I feel too is you have an entire support team that these folks are paying to make good documentation and to provide live support to a lot of your departments and institutes. So that can be a big help, save a lot of support load on both of our sides. Some of the disadvantages, expense is one of the things I keep on hearing over and over, and it makes a lot of sense to me. Oh yeah, I hear disagreement with that.
Yeah, well, the thing is it's not expensive, but it's perceived as expensive.
Perceived as expensive, yes.
Right. In the long run, when you're talking about support and everything else, it's not expensive. It's actually very inexpensive.
Take a server and put it under my desk.
Yes, and keep it up all the time.
It costs me, $900 up front, and I can run it for 10 years.
Yeah, and that's actually, that's. I think you hit it on the nose. I think I misstated it on the slide. That's absolutely our experience. We go into these smaller universities typically. At this point, I feel like most larger universities, they kind of get it. Like the value proposition is very clear there. Go into a smaller university, they have the server underneath, in their basement of some weird, like their computer science department. And there's some guy, Larry, that's kind of ran that for the last 10 years. And I mean, Larry's worried about his job. Everyone else feels like this is a very low-cost solution. So they see switching over to PaaS providers being very expensive. The piece of this I get is if you're running tons and tons of sites, most PaaS providers today require you to pay per site. And having to pay like $125 a month on Pantheon for every little tiny student group site, that's crazy, right? So that's one context in which I've seen people feel like there is added expense that I think is justified, but there's definitely ways of getting around that, and I think we'll talk about a couple of those. You're limited, so you are limited to the features they provide. I feel like those feature sets are usually very satisfactory and much better than what we could provide if we were trying to do custom hosting, but that there can be things that you're going to want that they don't have. And then like the bottom one goes back to, if you're providing support for your own hosting, you're going to know your stakeholders better than anyone else can. You're going to know how to fix their personal problems. You're going to be able to do that very, very quickly in a lot of cases. Although if you're on vacation or if you're asleep, obviously that's not the case. So again, I think that's a little bit of a red herring and probably a misrepresentation, but it's a common thing that I hear. It's like, oh, when our campus, humanities department starts asking about Drupal questions on the Pantheon support queue, it's kind of problematic. Whereas if they were doing all their support for hosting and all other concerns through us, then we could handle all those problems in one place. So, potential objection. So the next one, this is what we see a lot of very, very small institutions, and for us as vendors, I think it's one of the more challenging solutions, but there are some advantages to running your own on-campus hosting solution, either in the basement server closet or in the cloud. It can be highly cost-effective. especially if you're utilizing a cloud service and you have a specialized need for that. You can fix the problems. If something comes up, you can have a unified support queue for all your concerns. And you're potentially more responsive and more customized support than the past providers. The disadvantages, though, are pretty substantial and very difficult for us as vendors to kind of understand why this would be your go-to solution. A lot of times for us, unless you have great documentation and a very locked down system, it's a very challenging workflow for us to use. We may not have separate environments for doing our QA, for doing our development, if we want to actually have some separate feature branches where we can actually do some QA on tiny little features. And it's just getting another developer on here, having to send out SSH keys, SSH in, get the database, get the code, get the files, get it down to whatever our local development solution is. It's a bit of a drag. And yeah, as we just discussed, cost savings with this approach are pretty deceptive. I think we've kind of discussed that pretty sufficiently. And anyone that wants to provide their own support, welcome to do it. It's obviously some issues. This third option, and this is the most overused meme ever, but I love it. So let's double down on Morpheus. The third type of option is kind of this hybrid. And I think this is something that may actually become a lot more popular, particularly at larger institutions in the coming years. We have a lot of really good tool sets nowadays for running the type of infrastructure that previously was only in the purview of providers like Pantheon or Acquia, or Amazon. In specific, I'm really interested in Docker and its opportunities, and have seen a couple applications of Docker in higher education already that seem very promising to provide push-button solutions when you want to actually spin up infrastructure for anyone ranging from a tiny little department that's running on your most cookie-cutter distribution all the way up to your huge business school that has tons and tons of money and is doing some very custom applications on your infrastructure. Having a unified way of running infrastructure that satisfies all of those needs on both ends of the spectrum is really only a capability that we've gotten over the last couple of years with technology like Docker. And I think there's a potential that this could actually start taking over. And I'll have a link for this at the end of the presentation, but there's a pretty good slide deck by John Biccar from Stanford talking about their Dockerized program. I know that there's a lot of other universities doing similar things. How many folks are actually considering something like that? Is anyone kind of, okay, so and I'm interested, can you speak to kind of like what infrastructure you guys are?
So we have some in-house software that we make for other universities as part of the university. And I know our ops guys are on Docker. We have different development teams with Agile environment, so they're always spinning up. We just put everything, we're trying to put everything in Docker, and then trying to even reach out to other universities in the future, selling products and things. So it's kind of a both in-house and trying to become a vendor type thing.
Interesting. Yeah, would love to talk more about it actually afterwards. It sounds, very intriguing. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I feel like this could be a potential middle ground for mid-size and large institutions, and perhaps if there's more vendors that are sensitive to the higher education space that are entering the market, it'd be very cool to see a higher education, self-grown, organic product out there. I think that could be very interesting. So if hosting is our canvas, then campus distributions are a paintbrush. This is this is where we actually can provide standards for all of our departments and all of our vendors to follow. And I think I've seen a couple of different tactics here. The first one obviously is you don't have a distro, and there's a lot of reasons for that. The second one I call pseudo distro. This is another one of my attempts at categorizing something that perhaps defies categorization. When I say pseudo distro, I mean you're using something like multi-site organic groups to provide a unified experience for different sites, different departments that have unique URLs. They need maybe a slightly different theme, but you're all running that on one instance of Drupal or a different technology. And then official distro is one of the most popular and kind of becoming the gold standard at universities and has a ton of advantages that we'll discuss. And finally, I think we have actually exactly what Sean was referring to earlier, a more push-button SaaS offering, software as a service offering that you can offer to your departments and to vendors, where they can just spin up that site, start working with it, start customizing it. So the cases I've seen that make sense to me for just saying distro, what distro? We don't need a distro. If you only have one site, if you're just basically it's your mission site and then a couple of different institutes that are separated off, do you really need a distro? Probably not. You know, it's especially if there's no real distinguishing factor between these different separate sites you might have or different departments. You don't need a separate theme. You don't have radically different functionality. Bothering with the distribution probably doesn't make any sense. However, there is kind of this more middle ground situation where, yeah, you know, we don't need too custom of stuff, but we need to, you know, there's a little bit of special snowflake going on here. Not a ton, not prima donna style, but there's a little bit of special snowflake. And in these cases, a lot of people will be using Drupal multi-site or organic groups or domain access to help separate out the sites and get some unique themes and unique functionality. I think it hasn't frozen here. Oh, there we go. Yeah, and I think some of the advantages there, you get that control over the subdomains, and you can potentially reduce your hosting costs this way as well. I mean, you only have to host one site potentially. There's some good, you know, Acquia has an offering for doing multi-site. Can actually scale to hundreds of sites, and that, you know, works pretty well. It's pretty cost effective. I think the disadvantages that we've seen with that, obviously if you're hosting hundreds of sites on one instance, you know, if you have one problem in one place, all your sites are going to go out. You know, it's kind of the Christmas tree light situation. You know, one light goes out, they all go out. So single point of failure can be a problem. It's a challenging vendor onboarding, having downloaded large multi-site instances in the past. You know, it's like I'm waiting for just my Git repository to pull down for, you know, tens of minutes. You know, if you have like a shared files directory, God forbid you have a shared files directory for that, gigabytes and upon gigabytes of files. You know, it gets ridiculous. You're symlinking things. You have to do, you know, a bunch of different workarounds to kind of get that going in a local development environment. There's potential scaling issues. These seem to have been largely mitigated in a lot of cases I've seen, but I think there are definite limitations. And you're going to run into a problem eventually, even if you're a smaller institution. If you're growing, you're going to have people that have special snowflake issues, and it's going to be hard to sell your campus stakeholders on the fact that, hey, you only have this very tiny sandbox to play in. You're not really going to be able to hire vendors easily to work on that and extend that. So in my mind, kind of one of the best case scenarios you can have is an official distribution. One of the most successful distributions that we've worked on and actually had kind of a hand in making its early first stages of development is the ASU WebSpark distribution. There's a good case study about that on Pantheon, actually. I'll have a link for that at the end as well. Is anyone not familiar with what a distribution is? Okay, cool. I think we're all on the same page there. Nice thing about distributions, they give you a standardized spot to start from, so they're highly customizable. You have a much easier workflow if you're going to be working with it as a vendor. You know, you can fork a distribution. You can download the distribution and add modules to it. You know how to use a standard distribution if you're a vendor. And then for large organizations, distributions can really help handle that special snowflake problem. Where your vendors can actually extend it very easily, add that new functionality, maybe change around the theme, although hopefully you have some regulations as a university around what's acceptable in your branding guidelines or not. In my mind, there's kind of this extra step that you can take beyond a distribution where you have a push button SAS solution that's available both to departments and to vendors. And this can really provide the easiest way to get everyone started and easily working. I think one of the biggest advantages here is, unlike a distribution where people can kind of do anything, a lot of times I've seen a very closed garden approach to these SaaS solutions. And you know, I say closed garden, that seems like a negative thing. In my mind, it's pretty positive in a lot of the contexts I've seen it. It prevents people that are making pretty small sites from going too far off their reservation, keeps them within the boundaries of your accessibility guidelines, your branding guidelines, and other super important things. You know, no one wants to get sued over accessibility guidelines because, you know, a campus student group decided to do like a MySpace style page with like neon text on like a white background or something. The other nice thing about this is the documentation I've seen for most of these SAS solutions is super good. There's some great documentation on the UCSF multi-site, their starter kit distribution that they have. Not exactly a SAS distribution, but very extensive documentation, great solution that's more or less push button for a lot of their departments. Likewise, the Stanford site's documentation is very, very nice, has some great options for for all their stakeholders. So those are some of the tools that I've really had success with. I'm curious, like, what other, if you were going to add another slide to this presentation, which I have too many slides already, but if you're going to add another topic, I should say, what would be like the first thing that you would want to add? Because there's some really other important topics beyond hosting and distributions.
So what about white labeling a vendor pass solution?
Oh.
Not like full white labeling, but like we use Pantheon, but we are the contact for that. We don't want departments just to go to Pantheon and use their own purchasing card, even though there is something on Pantheon. I want them to come through us. They have to pay through us. We charge them, and we provide the distro through our service. So yeah, it's still called Pantheon, and they know that it's a vendor, but they do have to come through us in order to get there.
Interesting. That would be, yeah, and I don't know, I mean, I feel like the UCSF multi-site install, I mean, it's
a
awkward on the
similar
back end,
thing,
right? But I mean, I guess that's kind of, but I feel like that's a lot more nuanced. There's some really interesting things to explore there. Have you seen anyone that's actually doing that?
Well, we are.
So you have a separate pay page, you just route people there and no one knows it's Pantheon?
Yeah, the way the education organization works is that if they make the site part of the organization, we have full access to it. Drush and everything has access to it, which is nice because that means that something goes wrong, we can fix it, right? But it also means that they can't use a credit card to pay for their Pantheon account. The only way they can make their site live is by one of the organization admins, i.e. me, goes to there and selects what plan, and then Pantheon bills us quarterly for all of the sites in the organization, and then we just pass through the costs to all the departments.
Interesting.
UC Berkeley does something similar.
They do something very similar. We modeled ours off of Berkeley pretty
and
heavily.
Okay.
Cal has an in-house distribution, which they offer.
Yeah, and we do
people
too.
use that, but they also offer raw Pantheon sites for people who don't want to or can't use the distribution.
But you can still make it part of the organization,
But yes, it's
even
still
if
part of the organization. The billing
if you wanted to
is-
spin up like we did, you want to spin up Open Atrium, go ahead.
Yeah,
But it's
we
still
have
part of the
billing us.
organization.
You can still, yeah.
Through Cal.
Right.
Which I remember seeing kind of the early stages of that at Cal, back when they called it Zeus on Pantheon, you know,
Right.
like the organizational, yeah. But I haven't actually seen the new interface for doing purchasing and everything. I mean, probably because
It's
I'm on the other
basically
side.
the same thing. It's just the screen, instead of putting in your credit card, it just says, it just won't let you get there, and it says, here's the link, please contact your organization owners or whatever, and then we control what that link is, which just goes to a web form on a service catalog.
There's a campus chart string that they use to.
Yeah, and then they fill out the form and say, this is the account we want, here's the plan we want, yes, I agree to pay this money, et cetera, go, and then we
I
just
promise
switch
I won't
it.
put any sensitive information.
That's-
on
That's a field that we can.
Excellent disclaimer.
Yeah, well, we can do that on Pantheon as well. They give us a place where we can put our own language for that. So it's really nice to be able to do that. And it's free for
Interesting.
education, by the way, not Pantheon.
Not plum, yeah.
But it is free. Which
Just a
is
happy
pretty
customer.
Great for it used to be $1,000 a month, and now it's free. So
I mean, to have the organization.
yeah, the Zeus plan was $1,000
It was,
a month,
yeah.
and now it's free.
Yeah, that was-
Pay for the individual sites, but the overall management, I guess it's free out of the handle a little bit.
Right.
Interesting.
Right, the individual sites are the cost of whatever the sites are, but the organization account used to be very expensive, and now it's free. So.
Interesting. Yeah. No, that's really cool. I watching that evolve has been such a relief as a vendor, just because it's like this is the easiest way to work with you guys. I mean, this is so seamless. Yeah, I mean, how do we make it start having conversations like this? Is really what I've seen, and the Higher Education Summit is honestly the locus of that activity. I mean, you guys do a great job every year of running that, and the panels I've seen there have been, you know, some of the things that help evolve my thinking around what it means to be developing in higher education have come from that summit. But in short, I feel like our roles as vendors should be we are providing outside expertise. We are coming in to try to be Batman, but we have to be kind of tactical about that. And I think that's actually that question of asking where we can be Batman, where we actually have the expertise to really make dramatic change in organizations. That's when vendors need to ask ourselves, but we also need a lot of guidance. We need help because we're going to kind of come in and we're going to be the Godzilla busting through your organization if we're not guided in the right way. And a lot of that guidance happens through these tools that we've been discussing, building that effective architecture for both campus stakeholders and campus stakeholders in general. I think I saw Jordan raising his hand, and I know Jordan's a vendor, and he considers himself to be a campus stakeholder. I think that's absolutely correct. It's like I consider myself to be a campus stakeholder. Like I'm definitely somebody that participates on multiple campuses. I'm not like a department. I'm working for departments, but I'm still there, and I need help a lot of times focusing my work and providing a structure for that. Definitely happy to help improve that structure as well and be part of that conversation, but I'm more than happy to be guided in one direction instead of having 5 different options on how to solve a particular problem like hosting or a distribution. So in short, that's kind of I'm very glad that this has been a somewhat dynamic conversation. That's one of the things, like I said at the beginning, I love about working in higher education. Everyone's very open to new ideas, and it's often a dialogue, but if folks have more questions or comments, I'm really interested to hear them. Yes, sir.
What are some of the gotchas that you come across from transitioning from an on-campus solution to a hosted solution?
Interesting. Yeah, so we've done this at least once in my experience. One of the issues we've always had, site migration is one of the big things. A lot of times too, in the cases where we've been involved, a lot of times it's coming from an on-campus solution. So the hosting piece is usually kind of simple, but it's more the site refactor of moving from like a single monolithic site that's been hosted in the basement, right? To then now we're moving to Pantheon, we can build a distro, we can have separate campus sites. So now we actually have to refactor this single site into like 85 different sites.
Let me add to that. So one other big gotcha that we ran into, particularly with Pantheon because they use their goofy infrastructure, is the kind of integrations that you used to be able to have on an on-campus solution very well might go out the window. And
great point.
There's you have legacy systems like that, so it's legacy systems that rely on specific IP addresses for whitelisting access to databases. Well, now you need to connect to an Oracle database. Well, I don't think the Oracle driver is on Pantheon. And Pantheon doesn't have static IP addresses for outbound traffic, so we can't whitelist querying. Even if we could, get to it through a web service, we can't whitelist the IP address on Pantheon to do that. So a lot of the integrations, LDAP integration, let's say you have an Active Directory.
This is exact example.
Say, okay, well now we need to have SAML with our Active Directory or whatever, and then give me the IP address of Pantheon. Yeah, so it doesn't really work like that, right? Okay, how about a range? Okay, how about all of Rackspace? Here it is. Literally, that's what we have done, is we've figured out what the IP range of Rackspace is, which is hundreds of thousands of IP addresses, and gave it to our people like, yeah, all right, that's fine. Seriously?
I have clients that have had to do that before. The LDAP thing, actually, that was basically the crux of the case study that I mentioned earlier, was a big piece of that project was difficulties with an LDAP server migrating to Pantheon and then having to kind of reconfigure some things in there.
We've also spun up AWS EC2 instance, actually moved it to Beanstalk, but that sort of ends up being a proxy in the middle. So it's like, okay, here's your static IP address, whitelist this, and we'll just run drush on that every now and then to talk between the two. And it's janky, and it's a point of failure, which has failed, but gotta do what you gotta do.
I kind of could say what I was going to say, because we migrated a department site, and there were integration issues and complexity issues, and I kind of learned 2 things. One is some things you just figure out you don't need. It's like we thought we really needed this, and we're managing without.
Yep.
And some things there's a non-technical solution, and some things you want to run your own static site. So we ended up doing an integration where we had a static site for some things and the Drupal site for this stuff. And we've actually got another site I'm involved with. They run a tiny little static site where UC Berkeley, and they have an infrastructure for running static sites, and they can do just 2 or 3 things there. But then the main site's on Drupal to get all the advantages of Drupal. So
that's awesome.
That's a way to work around the fact that particularly
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Well, everyone wants to be. We're all special. In the back, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was actually just gonna, another gotcha, I'm from OSU, another gotcha that we had, we went to Acquia starting about a year ago. And just a couple things to keep in mind. There's a certain loss of control going from on-prem to a hosted solution. You know, there's certain, lately we've been battling varnish configs, and like Acquia only wants to touch varnish configs once a week, right? It's like, really? You know, and you know, we rely on their support organization or, you know, their engineers for certain things, and having really great workflows and really great interactions with them is so critical to our success. And having been a shop that did everything in-house for a long time, we didn't really have to ask anybody to do anything for us. That was a big change for us. And I would also just echo, we moved, I don't know, about 50 D7 sites up there in the last year, and definitely it's a site-by-site thing, you know, and pretty much everything needed some fiddling, you know, just because of all the integrations to different services on campus, or, you know, different module support up in Acquia or whatever.
Well, it's weird. I feel like it's a pain in the ass to have to do that, but once you kind of narrow it down onto this single platform, at least you're starting to reduce some of the complexity, right?
Yeah.
I feel like that's been kind of a relief in some cases once you get over the hump. But
Yeah, one of the drawbacks of doing a white label service, or even going, like you're talking about losing control, is, okay, well, if Acquia goes down, or, you know, Dyn goes down, like, it's like,
Per se.
well, how come the sites are down? What's wrong with you? Well, it's not my fault, I swear. Like, yeah, but you picked Acquia, right? So, like,
you picked the best.
so then you're sort of like made blamed for something that's, I guess, kind of your fault, but not really.
Just this is not super relevant, but interestingly, Acquia's homepage was down, and the cloud interface was down, and the Insights was down yesterday, but our homepages stayed up. All
Right.
our pages stayed
Well,
up.
that's because it's DNS.
Well, yeah, actually, as an Acquia, it was, yeah, because all of our Acquia domains were using Dyn.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
And how do you feel as a Dyn customer now?
Right. So, yeah. But yeah, all of our cloud services, you know, it wasn't just Acquia, right? We had Box and Qualtrics and many others that were.
Gmail was down.
Yeah.
Gmail was down.
Jeez. Yeah, I feel bad for the Dyn guys because I feel like they're, you know, the whole marketing push is like, yeah, we're this completely distributed system that should never be able to go down, and then, yeah, not so much on that.
I think the one takeaway from that is, and to your point, Sean, is that, you know, it comes back to like one throat to choke when you have an external vendor, right? Yeah, people are yelling and screaming at you, but you can turn around and go to Pantheon or go to Acquia and go, this sucks, fix it, right? And you don't have to technically be the one fixing it, you just have to be kind of quarterbacking the communication saying that we're
Right.
through it.
But it still looks bad for us,
Sure.
you know, because the
Yeah.
campus people don't know and they don't care,
Yeah.
you know. And I feel powerless, and you lose your control.
Right.
So that's the.
Yep.
Well, that's
I'm okay
actually.
with that because of all the other benefits, but those are one of the things that show up.
And that is interesting too, because I mean, I guess that's one of the potential disadvantages of having the type of system that Berkeley and UC Davis now have, right? Where it kind of hides the Pantheon relationship a bit. Because I know for us, and this is usually with our private industry clients, but you know, if they know it's Pantheon that's hosting their site and they're paying Pantheon every month directly, it's like if something goes wrong. Yeah, there's a little bit of, you know, the problem is on us because we recommended the service, but for the most part they understand. It's Pantheon, it's Acquia, you know, we need to file a support ticket, and things are only going to happen as fast as the past provider upstream fixes things.
You'll have executives that overreact too, right?
Yeah.
And so they'll question your decisions to go with
Absolutely.
an online vendor, and the next time, like we were trying to get our Acquia contract, and our vendor for our LMS went down, and our LMS was down for a week.
Yeah.
Right? And during that process, we actually took we got an older, not that old, export of the LMS, and host brought it up locally. It's like, I mean, not just like went down for a week, but almost like the vendor we thought was actually going out of business. Like we thought they were just not returning the phone calls.
Yeah, that's kind of, yeah.
And so now they're like, oh God, no vendor, you know? And we're trying to get this Acquia contract. Now we have to answer all these extra questions about, well, are they a good, you know, vendor or whatever, right?
Yeah. Trials and tribulations. Wow, stuff word there. Yeah, I think we should probably start wrapping up. And I know folks are probably going to want to get some. It's 12 o'clock. I think Acquia has been nice enough to give us lunch.
Ooh, all
so, yeah.